Hi everyone, this is topic 4, oral language, situations of oral communication. Introduction. Traditional grammars solely paid attention to the written language, while speech was discarded on the assumption that it was disorganized and featureless. Fortunately, modern linguistic analysis has readdressed the balance by paying attention to spoken language as well as written. In this sense, the advent of a communicative approach, whose main objective is the development of communicative competence, has clearly brought about an important shift towards the oral register. Needless to say, both spoken and written languages are forms of the same language. It is the same linguistic system underlying them. However, what is important to note is that they exploit different features of the system and gain their power in different ways. This is essential in the language classroom, since neither teachers nor students should aim for the same results and types of behavior in the two mediums. The Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, the companion volume, and the official curriculum for official language schools highlight the importance of distinguishing both modes of expression. The teacher needs to be aware of the characteristics of each mode so as to teach learners how to communicate effectively depending on the channel of communication. Features of the spoken language. In essence, oral expression is less conceptually dense, it is closer to our experience, more universal and spontaneous, and less abstract than the written form. We shall now proceed to analyze it in further detail according to different criteria. Syntactic and grammatical features. Speech usually presents short utterances, which are generally incomplete. Also, sentence coordination is preferred to subordination, and repetition of utterances is admitted. Grammatical features specifically associated with speech include interrupted constructions, disjointed constructions, incomplete constructions, and non-standard grammar. Lexical features. The vocabulary is often less formal, and colloquial expressions may be present, as well as slang and contractions. Also, vocabulary tends to be very general with a low degree of explicitness. Spontaneity phenomena such as frequent pauses, interruptions of the natural flow of spontaneous speech through the use of fillers, repetitions, hesitations, and false starts. Paralinguistic and supralinguistic elements. The spoken language is largely characterized by the presence of these elements, which include facial expressions, gestures, body movements, and proximity. Voice quality, also intonation, rhythm, stress, juncture, and pause. Permanence. Whereas spoken language is fleeting, it happens. Written language is permanent, it exists. Complexity. Writing and speech represent different modes of complexity, the most salient difference lying in the nature of clauses. Essentially, the spoken language tends to have shorter clauses connected by more coordinate conjunctions. Also, whereas the written language gains its complexity through dense lexical context, oral speech achieves it through highly complex sentence structure. Formality. Speech is intrinsically less formal than writing. That means that students should be allowed to use incomplete utterances, hesitation, and so on in their oral contributions. Context. Since we're usually in the same place at the same time when we talk to each other, our language can partly depend on the context. Written language, however, needs to be context independent. Turn-taking versus monologic organization. The language we use in a spoken situation will typically be organized according to the turn-by-turn sequencing of talk. Written language, on the contrary, will be produced as a monologic block. It is worth noting that functional grammars defend the study of oral language by claiming that it is much more richly developed and more fully revealed than written language. The reason for this, they sustain, lies in the fact that spoken language is largely unconscious and spontaneous, therefore showing a grammatical and semantic variation which is hardly ever attained in writing. Processing conditions of speech. Processing conditions involve the time factor. In speech, the words are being spoken as they are being decided and as they are being understood. This affects the speaker's ability to plan and organize the message and to control the language being used. We often make syntactic mistakes, forget things we intended to say, or repeat what we've already said before. The words are also being spoken as they are being understood, that is, listening comprehension. This places a great burden on the students, since they have to keep up with the speed of the voice, which is very often disembodied. However, we may minimize this difficulty by using videos or podcasts, which are increasingly more present in our classrooms thanks to the internet and the numerous didactic materials carefully devised by the different publishing houses. On a different level, while the reader can reread, the listener can have memory problems which can lead to misunderstandings or to a request for repetition. Furthermore, the listener may miss a part of what was said, perhaps through noise or a moment's distraction. Reciprocity conditions of speech. A remarkable feature of speech is that it is a reciprocal activity. Speech offers the possibility of checking the listener's reactions, asking for clarification, reformulating what was said, and so on. This way, the message can be adjusted from moment to moment and understanding can be improved. In this sense, reciprocity may be an advantage, but it is also an obligation since it forces us to take notice of the other. It involves varying our degree of formality. It enables the speaker to choose topics which are likely to be interesting to the other party, and so on and so forth. Situations of spoken communication. Spoken language situations present the following characteristics. They can be interactive, there can be two or more participants, they can be face-to-face, in the same place at the same time. Language is usually used as action. Using language to accomplish some task is quite common. It is spontaneous. What is going to be said goes without rehearsing. It is casual and it is informal. Oral production and coproduction. In oral production activities, the language user produces an oral text which is received by an audience of one or more listeners. In interactive activities, the language user acts alternately as speaker-listener with one or more interlocutors so as to construct conjointly through the negotiation of meaning. Reception and production strategies are employed constantly during interaction. There is a further classification of oral production and interaction activities, for example, interactional versus transactional, that is, interactional uses of language are the ones which lay emphasis on creating harmonious interactions between participants, that is, they are listener-oriented, whereas transactional uses of language, in this case the language is being used primarily for communicating information, that is, message-oriented. We can also find short versus long turns. What is expected of speaking in a long turn is considerably more demanding than what is required in a short turn. An example of long turn would be storytelling. Oral comprehension. In oral comprehension activities, the language user as listener receives and processes a spoken input produced by one or more speakers. There is a further classification of oral comprehension activities according to several criteria. There are reciprocal versus non-reciprocal activities, conversational versus academic activities, inductive versus deductive, that is, top-down processes, those would be inductive, and bottom-up processes, those would be deductive. And finally, activities according to the purpose. The productive and receptive dimensions of oral communication. Communication, whether written or spoken, involves two types of skills: productive, including speaking and writing, and receptive-interpretative, including listening and reading. The oral register is shared by speaking and listening, which shall now be treated separately in order to focus on the peculiarities of each. Productive skill, speaking. The nature of communication. When speakers use the language for communication, they undergo the following processes. First, they want to say something. Second, they have some communicative purpose. And third, they select from their language store. There are three speaking dimensions. The first one is the manipulative dimension. Learners have to become familiar with the mechanics of oral speech. Repetition can be crucial here, and in this sense, some specific exercises called drills may be devised. The second dimension is the productive dimension. We're here referring to the cognitive and conceptual ability to speak in the L2, prior mastery of the linguistic system. Due to the processing conditions of speech, speakers need to develop some facilitation strategies and compensation mechanisms, for example, by simplifying grammatical or lexical structure, by ellipses, by using formulaic expressions, or by the use of fillers, pauses, or hesitation devices. Speakers also use mechanisms to compensate for the problems which arise out of the time pressure. These are called strategies. Last but not least, there's the interactive dimension. We're here referring to the ability to maintain a conversation. This interactive dimension requires two things: negotiation skills and familiarization with communicative routines. A note on pronunciation. For very long, the objective of language instruction and pronunciation was to attain native-like performance. However, research has proven that such an objective is achieved by very few, and so the goal of a perfect accent seems inappropriate and largely demotivating for the majority of learners. Indeed, the Common European Framework emphasizes that our goal should be the attainment of a threshold level of pronunciation, that is, intelligibility, rather than native-like performance. In other words, our objective as teachers should be for the learner to pronounce accurately enough to be easily and comfortably comprehensible for other learners. In this sense, we must primarily consider the effects of mispronunciation and the degree of tolerance that listeners will have for this. Regarding the accent, we may teach any accent, provided that the model chosen is a standard one that is easily understood by other speakers of the language. In any case, it is strongly advisable to give learners at least some exposure to several types of accents. Receptive-interpretative skill, listening. The nature of communication. When listeners try to understand what speakers say, they undergo the following processes. First, they want to listen to something. Second, they are interested in the communicative purpose of what is being said. And third, they process a variety of language. The goal of teaching listening should be to enable students to understand with reasonable ease both native and non-native speakers of English when they speak at normal speed. Top-down and bottom-up processing phenomena in listening. These phenomena are both used whenever we listen. Sometimes one predominates, sometimes it's the other, but both are needed. The bottom-up approach sees comprehension as a matter of going from the units to the global. Listeners first decode sounds, then words, and then sentences. The top-down approach sees understanding as starting from the listener's background knowledge of the non-linguistic context and of working down towards the individual sounds. Subskills involved in listening. It is important to note that the skills involved in listening are largely subconscious in the L1, but they can certainly create barriers for the learner in the L2. This is the reason why they should be reactivated and therefore allowing to lower the student's anxiety. Some examples of subskills would be prediction, scanning and skimming, recognizing functions and discourse patterns. So you know that, for example, introduces an example. When you hear, in other words, you know that it's about to be a reformulation of the previous sentence and so on. Deducing meaning from context, distinguishing between literal and implied meanings, and tolerating ambiguity. In conclusion, there has been traditionally a disregard for spoken language, essentially because of the assumption that it was formless. It was believed that speech was confined to short bursts, full of false starts, lacking in logical structure, etc. But this is clearly a myth, since it prevents us from recognizing the critical role it plays in the learning. The oral register is shared by speaking and listening, which, though sharing the same medium, differ in the cognitive processes they require, namely production in speaking and reception and interpretation in listening. This means talking about different procedures, techniques, and strategies in the classroom. In general terms, however, what is common to the teaching of the different skills is that tasks must reflect facts about real life, becoming sufficiently realistic, stimulating, and motivating for the learners. Besides, the skills tend to be taught contemplating three different stages. So there are the before activities, the while activities, and the after activities. Although this is applicable to all the skills, it becomes paramount in this case of the receptive-interpretative skills, since it allows for contextualization and the connection with productive skills, thus creating a product out of what has been listened to. To end with, it goes without saying that skills have to be integrated in the classroom in the same way they would be in real life. In the particular case of oral skills, many authors agree that in order to take active part in a conversation, you need to be both a good speaker and a good listener. Therefore, we should not stick to the traditional format speaking after listening, but rather involve the students in active conversation, being both speakers and listeners. Thank you very much for watching. Feel free to have a look at the other topics, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.